I am so happy, Lavanya, that you were able to spend a little bit of time for a quick conversation about the amazing work you do at Oxford Net Zero. The first question I have to ask you is a little bit about your journey. I'd love to hear a bit about how you first got involved in climate work, and maybe if you felt so inclined, something about your story or your journey that we might not otherwise see on your bio or CV.
Thank you. My story. I've always been sort of interested in environmental issues, and I sort of volunteered at animal welfare and animal sort of shelters when I was a child, and I turned vegetarian when I was 16. And so sort of going from there to environmental sort of activism, and environmental law was sort of a natural progression for me. And when I joined law school, I was sort of naturally drawn, as I said, to environmental issues and environmental law, and at some point to public international law and the ways in which public international law can work to support environmental outcomes, positive environmental outcomes. So sort of was a natural transition in that sense. So it emerged from a place of actually being passionate about environmental causes.
I love that idea that you can even track it back to being in childhood, like, being close to animals and going through that process of becoming a vegetarian quite early. That's super interesting. And then sort of having that be sort of a guide, I guess, of where you then went through your work around law. Can I ask you where you find your inspiration? Are there sort of places you go or music you listen to that you go to when you're sort of looking for a source of energy?
Well, I do like listening to Nessun Dorma when I'm particularly looking for inspiration. So that's a particular source of inspiration, but that's just one source of inspiration. I think the inspiration really is what you see around you. Especially when you're working on climate change. You're beginning to see now a lot of the impacts. You're beginning to see how it affects all of us, but certainly how it affects, particularly vulnerable sort of populations around the world. And my work has, at least in the past, pre-COVID, taken me to many of these places. So I've been to small island states like, Republic of the Marshall Islands and Fiji and other places where you can see real sort of perceptible impacts of climate change. And so the desire to do something that could contribute to resolving that issue, or at least addressing that issue, sort of comes from that place of actually seeing impacts and seeing the consequences that climate change can have for us, and for even more than for us, more vulnerable populations around the world. But of course, all of us contribute in different ways. And so there are those who would go out and, march on the streets, and then there are those who would bring their particular skills to bear in trying to address this issue. And my comparative advantage is not marching on streets. My comparative advantage is my legal skills. And so that's what I like to bring to this problem.
I actually really do believe, I believe two things. I believe that accountants will save the world. I also think lawyers can save the world too, because a lot of the work that is needing to be done at sort of a systems level comes down to the rules of the game and how people follow those rules. And so there is a critical role for, as I say, accountants who can sort of measure and value sort of all these positive and negative externalities, but also lawyers who do this important work. So I think I might have to sort of start printing some new t-shirts that say lawyers will save the world to go along with the accountants will save the world. Well, and so maybe I can ask you a little bit more about the particular areas of research you're focused on. I wonder if you could share like some of the big questions you're looking into in the work you're focused on at the moment.
So I'm an international climate change lawyer, and maybe 15 years ago, this wasn't a thing to be an international climate change lawyer. More broadly, I'm a public international lawyer, and I work in particular in the ways in which public international law can be used to address climate change, which means I look at how states can come together and the relationships between states primarily in crafting treaties, reaching agreements to address climate change. So that's sort of broadly the field that I work in, but specifically within that field of international climate change law, I focus on a couple of big questions, I guess. One big question that I look at is the issue of equity and fairness and ways in which equity and fairness can be sort of expressed in international agreements. So there are various ways in which equity and fairness can be expressed in international agreements. You could have, for instance, provisions that provide different kinds of assistance to different groups of parties, because some states, and by parties I mean parties to treaties, some states require more assistance than others. You could have provisions that actually differentiate between states in terms of the nature of obligations themselves, so that some states actually have different obligations to others. Much of this is sort of anathema to sort of traditional doctrine in international law, that, you actually have the traditional doctrine is that, all states are sovereign equals. And so, you should have equal or at least symmetrical obligations for all states. But when we're addressing something as complex, a polycentric issue like climate change, you can't have a one-size-fits-all approach to it. So part of my work is looking at how you can craft treaties such that you can be fair to parties, fair to states that have different needs, that have differing abilities, and also have contributed differently to the problem. So, the small island states have contributed little or nothing to creating this problem, but they're going to bear the brunt of it. And this is also true for, vast populations in large developing countries as well, where, they don't even have access to modern forms of electricity, but are being asked to, but these countries are being asked to take very stringent measures to reach net zero. So, how do we resolve these sort of problems and puzzles at the heart of international climate regulation? And that's sort of a big question that I'm asking in my research.
Wow, I'm just imagining this sort of a giant sort of puzzle and sort of trying to figure out how these different extraordinary pieces all kind of fit together, and sort of what that jigsaw looks like and how you sort of try and fit these elements. So thank you. That's really interesting to hear more of those questions. Now, we might have some of our listeners who are tuning into this series of interviews coming from the business community. And I wondered if there were any reflections you have on the research you're doing, your exploration and inquiry into these questions that you think are relevant or meaningful for people that are coming with a business background.
Yeah, so I spoke just now about one strand of my research. Another strand of my research is actually looking at how rules are actually made and how you craft rules in international international instruments. And so when I talk about rules, I'm talking about rules that might relate to the nature of obligations states have, but it could also be rules that relate to how you operationalize some of those obligations. So for instance, market-based mechanisms that we had under the Kyoto Protocol and are also sort of a part of the toolkit that we have under the Paris Agreement. There are rules being crafted around markets, how these markets will function, how do you account for greenhouse gas emissions, how do you account for trading of greenhouse gas emissions between different states. Those kinds of rules will obviously have an impact also on business and industry, because states will regulate their business and industry in line with the kinds of rules that the international community puts in place. So there are various ways in which the business community is going to be impacted, and that's one way where the rules of the game actually impact them, because they're at the sort of again, at the front line of actually trying to address this issue, because they're actually producing a lot of the emissions that we're trying to curtail and to limit. But another way in which they're also engaged in a sort of critical in this entire sort of conversation is in relation to actually fulfilling and helping fulfill obligations. So it's not just the rules impact them, but they can actually, and so they need to be aware of these rules, but it is also that they can actually lead the charge. And many are leading the charge. So when, for instance, the U.S. under Trump withdrew from or announced a withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, coalition of businesses and universities and others came together and said, well, we can still do this. We're going to meet the commitment that Obama put in place, right? So I think it's much of this, all of this impacts business, how they do business, and how they do business, not just in terms of just making sure they meet the rules or sort of are in compliance with the rules, but also just fundamentally reorient their business practices to be in line with the net zero world.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I'm curious. When we talk about this sort of net zero world, I know that that's something we're all working quite closely and hard to build. I wondered if you could imagine sort of 2030 and tell me a little bit about what you think things are going to look like then. Do you have any sort of sense of where you see things going next?
Well, where I think it's going next, or where I would like it to go next.
Oh, well, you could answer both questions, actually. Which one would you prefer?
Well, I'd like to paint a picture of a world that I'd like to see in 2030 and in 2050. I'm not sure the reality is going to match up to that world that I'd like to see in 2030 and in 2050.
Well, let's start with what that vision is, and then maybe I can ask you a follow-up, which would be what you think will be the barriers to meeting that vision.
So the vision is that in 2030 we will have various commitments in place. We will be on track to reaching net zero in 2050. We would have not just put in place sort of mechanisms and tools and methods and means to actually get to net zero by 2050, but we would have done it in a way that's fair and just across countries and across constituencies. So so the global South, the global North, we would make sure that there is a fair fair division of responsibilities. And there's a sense of ownership as a result of that, a sense of ownership that everybody has. So part of the challenge, I think, with trying to trigger and catalyze a sense of ownership amongst all constituencies, all actors, all states, is that some of the agenda is perceived as being driven by the global North or framed by the global North. So I think what I'd like to see in 2030 is a sense of ownership amongst all constituencies, all actors, business, industry, non-state, youth, all actors, and in all states, that this is actually something we believe in, we want it to happen, and that we're doing it in a fair and just way. And it's only if we're there in 2030 that we can get to a net zero world in 2050.
Yeah, I'm totally with you on this. And we've been spending a bit of time at the Skoll Center and with B Lab trying to document some of the stories of companies that are, really centering their climate action in the principles of climate justice. So certainly really believe at a fundamental level how critical this work is for that 2030 and then 2050 and beyond vision.
Right.
I do want to come back though and ask you, what do you think are the obstacles or the barriers that are in front of us to making that happen?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are sort of course many obstacles and barriers. I think most of them can be surmounted. None of them are insurmountable. But I think perhaps political will is the one that will take the most to surmount, in a sense. I think political will exists in some quarters of the world, not in all quarters of the world. And there may be political will to do something domestically. There may not be political will to provide support to others to do it. I think political will is the key to this. Political will to ensure that even if you take long-term commitments and you announce long-term commitments, that you make sure the short-term actions are aligned with long-term actions, and that short-term actions are aligned not just with long-term actions for yourself, but actually there is a shared vision across the globe and across actors that each actor actually contributes to and enables.
I think that framing of the both and, I'm kind of picking that up. It's like, both, the short term and the long term, and both the individual actions that can be done and how these things contribute to a system. And that's where you're sort of putting together the pieces of the puzzle, I think are so critical. Lavanya, I've got one last question I'd love to ask you. And it's a question knowing that some of the audience that will be tuning in to these interviews are probably going to be a lot of young people on the Oxford campus or attending virtually. And I wondered if you just have any pieces of advice for some of those young people in terms of, what they explore while studying, how they can engage in some of these important issues. What would you advise them to keep their eyes on, or, the motivation you would encourage them to have when it comes to addressing these interconnected emergencies?
So I think for the young and from the young, what we need is their passion, and their commitment to this cause. As I said right in the beginning, all of us come to this with differing advantages, that we can bring to bear. And what I bring to it is my sort of years of legal skill and training, and what they bring to it at that stage is their passion, commitment, and enthusiasm, and their faith that we can actually, faith that we can actually resolve this and address this issue. And that's the starting point, and we need to build on that. And I think there are multiple ways in which they could engage, and that age and in that stage in their lives, they could they have a panoply of choices before them, right? So they could of course march in the streets, which is sort of very valuable work. They could try and convince their families and friends and parents, and and they could convince others beyond that sort of immediate sort of circle as well. They could take courses which deal with it. I mean, I teach a graduate course in international environmental law. A lot of it is on climate change law. I mean, I have Brazilian climate litigators coming and talking to my students, about cases they are filing against Bolsonaro's government, the sort of, environmental dismantling of environmental regulations there, or the fact that they're not doing enough on climate change. I have, barristers from London coming to talk to my students about cases they're filing before the European Court of Human Rights. 33 Portuguese, 33 European countries have actually been sort of brought to notice on their climate change actions by a group of 33 by a small group of Portuguese children and youth activists. And these are the kinds of cases that also trigger change. And there are many cases being brought by children and youth. So yes, go out there and march on the streets, go out there and find legal skills and training, and make an impact like that. Go out there and find some barristers or lawyers who are going to help you file cases. There are so many ways in which youth can contribute. And yeah, of course, go do courses. Well, not just mine, but there are plenty of courses that you could do to sort of build the skills on top of the passion that you have.
Oh, great. I think you might have a few requests after this video, Lavanya, of people wanting to come in and either take your class or audit your class. So get ready for a flurry of emails. Well, what a fascinating conversation. I know these are audio files, so people are only going to be able to hear us, but I've got a giant smile on my face from this conversation, because from where we started, your story, to really sort of understanding the importance of law and the journey you've been on, and the questions you're asking in your research, to this point about really how and where businesses can engage, but actually more than businesses, it's all of us as people. And actually early on in our conversation, you said a really important line that I wrote down. You said, all of us have a contribution to make. And I think that's going to be something I would encourage people to hold as they listen and hopefully re-listen to this recording of the extraordinary work you're doing. So Lavanya, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. And what I would say is, for anyone who is interested in learning more about what Lavanya is working on, through her research, and learning more about how it fits into the overall Oxford Net Zero program, please check out the website, and we'll make sure that you're able to access and be able to engage with some of the materials we've shared today. So thank you again, Lavanya, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.
Thank you. This is very much my pleasure.